we were involved with renovating or doing additions to over 600,000 square feet of historical properties, either national or local historic properties. And in addition to that, in 1979, my wife and I moved into this ancient house in Evanston, Illinois, which we found out about 10 years later was part of a National Historic District. So we didn't even know it when we bought it. We spent 35 years renovating it and never finished the project. But fortunately, we sold it to a friend of our son's who is now continuing that process of renovating the house. So I understand the importance of history in neighborhoods like this because we lived in it. So when we moved here 4.5 years ago, we moved into Sunnyside. I was convinced before we we're looking at houses and all this, I was convinced we were going to move into the Alphabet District or the West Hills because this is where we came from. That was sort of the look of where we'd come from. But we made the conscious decision that we wanted, as we grow older, we wanted to be in a much more urban kind of setting. Some place where we could walk, the grocery stores and the bank and the barber and all that. So we found this house in Sunnyside, and the day after we saw it the first time, we went back the next day, walked down to Hawthorne Street. My wife saw the New Seasons Market, and she said, "We're buying this house." So it's very important to us and we're very happy. We're very happy being where we are. We think it's fabulous. But one of the things that struck me about Portland in general is sort of the lack of historical districts, or the lack of understanding how important history is to a community. And I started this because I was really interested. I didn't know anything about Portland. So I started walking around Sunnyside, which is really not a very big area. So I got a population of about 7,200 people. So I started walking around Sunnyside because I learned about this thing that we have here called the HRI, Historic Resource Inventory. So, oh, this is pretty cool. I want to see what houses are on that HRI list. And so I started walking around Sunnyside looking at these HRIs, and I'd see an HRI house. I said, okay, fine, but then a house right next to it was not. And so I said, well, this is kind of crazy. We've got all these historic properties here in Sunnyside. Why isn't this a historic district? I'm thinking, boy, this would be great. Let's turn this, I'm so naive, just moving here. Let's turn this into a historic district. So I walked around and looked at every single house, and I created my own list of all the properties that I felt were historically significant. And then I started reading about some of the issues associated in Portland about other neighborhoods that had tried to form historic districts. And I read about Buckman, how contentious that was. And I said, boy, if Buckman can't pull this off, there's no way our little socialist Sunnyside is going to be able to do anything like this. And so I just sort of let that sit for a while. But it was this process that opened my eyes to how important the history is to these cities, particularly Portland. And Eastmoreland, when I first drove through Eastmoreland, I said, Christ, why isn't this a historic district? It ought to be. I mean, it's so incredible. I mean, it's just an amazing neighborhood. So I got myself involved with the Vista Bridge Committee because I was very upset about the chain link fence, which is still there 4.5 years later. Got myself on the Sunnyside board, got myself on the Southeast Uplift board, and then I got appointed to this residential infill thing. And this residential infill project really started, I think, as a result of a group of people called United Neighborhoods for Reform, UNR, who were a loosely organized group of people that were very upset about the demolitions that were happening in their neighborhoods. And it was up there on the Alameda Ridge and Brentwood Darlington and South Burlingame and a couple other major neighborhoods that developers were coming in, like you've seen here, tearing a house down, scraping it to the ground, and building something that was, I mean, inappropriate's not even the right word. They were just grotesque. They're just awful. And so there was enough pressure, I believe, put on Mayor Hales to form this committee. And so this committee, the Stakeholders Advisory Committee, started off with a task. Our tasks were to look at the scale of new houses, the scale of new infill. What are those things that are going in? Are there other housing forms that could be going in, other types of houses? And to look at these narrow and skinny lots. So that was our charge. And I thought, when I got involved in this, I said, oh great, this is going to make a math problem. We're going to talk about setbacks, we're talking about height and how you measure and how big and FAR and all this sort of thing. And so, boy, was I wrong. This process, there were, 24, 25 of us on this committee. Representatives from the coalitions, as I was one, a couple of architects, and several developers were on this group. So it was a very sort of easygoing thing. We talked about scale, and we talked about height, and how do you measure from the low point and the high point, and all these sorts of things. And then this idea that that residential infill should start solving the affordability problem. That the idea that increasing density in a neighborhood will drive prices down. Well, if that was the case, I'd be living in San Francisco or New York. Okay. But yet, it's this feeling, and I think you've probably heard this, that is permeating this whole residential infill. The affordable housing people were saying this, and the developers were saying this. The developers were also saying something that was pretty interesting to me, was that the zoning ordinance is only allowing them to build one type of product, and that's a large single-family house. Because they weren't able to say in a single-family zone, I can only build a single-family house, so I'm going to build this thing as big as I can to get the biggest profit. So they were saying, if you allowed us to build a duplex instead of a single-family house, or a triplex, or a fourplex, well, we can do that cheaper, we can bring that price down. So there was this, there was a group, there was a split in this committee, and 7 of us were on the side of neighborhood context, and the other whole group, 15 or so, were on the side of eliminate single-family zoning and let us build anything anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so that is where this thing sort of ended up in December, when our committee was essentially over. We were done, and the planning department took this to the mayor, or it went to city council. And there was, in December, there were several comments that happened, that the commissioners made amendments. They talked about all kinds of things, and then they put it back. The Mayor Hales was gone, and they put it back into the building, into the planning department, which is where it sits right now. So one of the things that came out, that one of the most contentious parts of this whole project was determining where you allow this residential infill to happen. I mean, what makes sense? Well, as I said, I live in Sunnyside. We're bordered by Hawthorne, and we're bordered by Belmont, okay? And when you drive down those streets, you see a lot of activity, a lot of apartment buildings being built, all that sort of stuff. And then when you move in, you're suddenly into a residential area. Boom. Now, almost all of Sunnyside is zoned R2.5, where you're mostly R5 here. So, our land is really tight, and we have a very, very high density. Okay, so what they're saying, what we were saying, is that according to the comprehensive plan and according to good planning, the development, this additional development, should happen along corridors where there's transit. I mean, you want people to be able to walk to a bus, walk to a train, and go downtown or get to where they need to go. So our feeling was that this giant overlay, where you allow these infill things to happen, should extend maybe 500 feet into those neighborhoods off of these major corridors. or maybe it's 600 feet, whatever that number is. Well, the map came back from the planning department and said, no, we're going to go a quarter mile off of these corridors. Well, I've got lots of things here that I'll show you, but a quarter mile off of corridors, centers and corridors, covers about 70% of all of the single-family neighborhoods in Portland. And so they're able to define these things the way they want it. Now, how'd they come up with a quarter mile? When we saw this map, we just went nuts. Because what they're saying is, we're going to basically allow multifamily development in virtually all of Portland. So let me hand around these little guys here.
Do you know who proposed that?
Well, it came out of the planning department. And so the group of people that were for this sort of, let's cover the whole city, said, well, this map doesn't go far enough. We should be able to cover the entire city, not just this 70% that we're talking about. So let me just give you a little, as I back up a little bit. This little guy that I'm handing out, this cute little 4-page thing, is a summary of the current residential infill plan. Now, there's so much information here, it's impossible to cover 18 months worth of stuff. If you are looking to learn more, you just Google Portland residential infill, and you'll get the residential infill site that the city has set up. And there's a little box that says map and documents. You click on that and you just get an endless amount of information about residential infill.
Planning and sustainability essentially devised the implementation rollout that's codified here. Did the city council approve it?
The city council approved it with recommendations. And that's what happened in December, or with amendments, okay? So shortly after that, we said, well, okay, some of these amendments are pretty good. Our group of 7 liked these amendments. Commissioner Fish said, I want to see a different map than this 1/4 mile overlay. I want to see different maps that show different dimensions. And so we grabbed onto that. We started lobbying the commissioners, and we kept hitting a brick wall about this. And so we found out, I think it was about late February, we found out that the current mayor, who is in charge of now BPS, told them to proceed and just kind of ignore those amendments. And so they are proceeding, BPS is currently proceeding with revising the December proposal, which is what you've got, that little handout. And they'll be coming back sometime this summer or late summer, early fall, with a new recommendation that's going to go to planning and sustainability. We will not see it. We're done. So all of our lobbying efforts have pretty much fallen on deaf ears because now it's become a political issue as opposed to a planning issue. Now we're trying to say, well, we need to accommodate all these hordes of people that are going to be coming in over the next 20 years. We've got residents that are screaming about affordability. And so politically we have to do something, to offset that. And so my gut feeling is that they're going to be recommending this 1/4 mile coverage from centers and corridors. And so that 1/4 mile, this is a map of the southeast quadrant. And virtually just got a couple little things that don't fit in this 1/4 mile deal. Eastmoreland is totally covered by this 1/4 mile from centers and corridors, except for a little, graphical things that will certainly disappear when they get down to the nitty-gritty of this map. So all of Eastmoreland will be part of this residential infill zone. All of Sunnyside. Virtually all the entire east side of Portland will be in this housing opportunity overlay zone. That's what they're calling it.
So you said it was the whole city of Portland, but is that true?
East side.
No, it's almost all the east side. But Karen, if you if you, I didn't print out what the map is, but you can dig into that website and you can see the actual map. It actually extends over on the west side as well, a little bit in the hills, and a lot down by, some of those neighborhoods that are southwest, whatever they're called.
So the single family zone, I thought you said earlier that they're trying to get rid of single family
Well, what
zoning in
the-
all of Portland.
Well, no, that was the goal of this other group.
Oh,
What they're doing with this overlay, like I said before, you have got a zone, your zoning is mostly R5.
right.
When this overlay goes in, the effective zoning is R2. So I live in R2.5 and it's pretty dense. So what does this mean? If you look at the third page in this teeny little booklet, there's some diagrams on the bottom that show you what would be allowed under this infill project in an R5 zone. And of course, in an R5 zone, you could have a house. They can do that. But under this, you can also have a house with an internal ADU. You can also have a duplex. You can also have a duplex with an ADU. Or you can build a triplex on the corners.
When will this go into effect?
Well, I think it won't go into effect until 2018, because they have to, what they're doing right now is writing the code or writing the ordinances that would put this into play. But it has to go to planning and sustainability. There's a little schedule on here that, that tells you when the implementation is going to happen. So, what does this mean? This means that if a house gets torn down and it's on a 10,000 square foot lot, okay, you could end up with a duplex and an ADU on each one of those. So you're going from a single family house to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 families. And parking, they didn't screw around with parking so much.
Obviously.
But parking, because they don't know what to do with it, you'd only have to provide parking for the house part. So the ADUs and so forth would just park on the street. This in my mind is where the historic district becomes so important. Because this whole thing gets triggered with the demolition, right? If a house comes down, this is what they can do with it. Now they did, during the course of the deliberations, they did impose a smaller size volume that can be built on that particular lot. But when you read the fine print, it really doesn't. They say that, well, we're going to limit the square footage to 2,000 square feet. If you provide an ADU, you get an additional 15%, which takes you up to 2,500 square feet, and basements don't count. So you can build a basement, and now you're at what? 4,000 plus the 800 square foot for the ADU. So the scale of houses really didn't get affected. The height did. You're going to go up 2.5 stories now instead of 3. And how you measure, we're no longer measuring from the high point of the lot. We're measuring from the low point, which is pretty significant, so you can keep that, you don't get a full third floor. So the area really didn't get affected. They changed the setbacks a bit. They pushed the setbacks an additional 5 feet. You've got 25 feet, I think, is your sort of typical setback in Eastmoreland. So they've gone from 10 feet to 15 feet. And it comes into play more when we're in an area like Sunnyside or Buckman, where the houses are a lot closer to the street. So it's triggered by demolition. So how do you stop demolition? You become a National Historic District. And I firmly believe that is the only way. You take matters in your own hand. We're tired of waiting for the city to do what's right for historical properties. They still haven't done it. That HRI was done in 1986 or 1988, and that hasn't been updated. So the inventory of historical properties is just a mess. It doesn't exist. To say nothing of the increase in real estate taxes, right? I mean, I don't know what the typical real estate tax is here, but I know in my neighborhood, These older houses might be paying $2,000, $3,500. A new house is paying $11,000.
Well, there are 9 and 10,000 and more for older houses here.
Right.
12.
Right. So when you get that new house built, it gets reassessed at a bigger value, market goes up, and the city gets about 25% of that total bill. So are they really in favor of keeping historic properties? No, they need some money. So that's why I think you're on the right path. I did spend 3 days with Rod Merrick walking around, I think it was the Berkeley edition, looking at all those properties. And I said, gosh, I feel like I'm in Sunnyside over here, you know. Unfortunately, you know, the Portland at large doesn't see that part of Eastmoreland. You know, they see the golf course and they see the houses along the hills. And so it's interesting to me how sort of universally hated you are.
No kidding.
You know, because of what you know, how you live and your houses and so forth. So there's an equity, now there's an equity issue here that, you know, everybody seems to be able to think that they should be able to live wherever they want to. And it's somebody else's job to provide that. And so Eastmoreland, unfortunately, has become the poster child of elitism, particularly with the historic district. Whereas before, like I said, I lived in one for 35 years and didn't even know it for 10 years. So it's a whole different attitude. Whole different attitude now.
So all of this density, and need for all of this increased housing is based on estimate of population increase.
Correct.
Who does that, and is that accurate, and what, I mean, that's.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Okay, great question, thanks, Karen. There's this group called Metro, which you've all heard of. I mean, they provide us with transit and a bunch of other stuff. One of their primary roles is to make population projections over where's the growth. And that's the group of people that are responsible for the urban growth boundary, which we all love. I love it. I can get to the wine country in 35 minutes, so I'm not in favor of expanding the urban growth boundary. But when they say, Metro came out, this was now maybe, 4 years ago or so, and said, you know, Portland, you're going to have an additional 230,000 people in the next 20 years. That's our projection. How are you going to deal with this? And so, every so often, Portland does this thing called a billable lands inventory. And this was part of my research in Sunnyside. I looked at this buildable lands inventory, and when I worked out the math, I said, you know, they were telling me that Sunnyside was supposed to absorb something like 600 additional single-family houses. Well, there isn't an empty lot in Sunnyside to be had. So I said, where's this land supposed to come from? So what they've done is when they said, and this is over time now, this isn't the first time this overlay idea has come up. These overlay things have existed in Portland for a long time. And so there are a number of initiatives right now that exist on the books that allow people to build more density. Okay? And so when the buildable lands inventory came out in, it was 2010, it said Portland has enough land to take care of this growth. And they repeat that again in the comprehensive plan. So what's the deal? If we have enough land, why are we doing this? We've never gotten an answer for that. Because the only thing I can think of is they're worried about after this group comes in. Okay? So this buildable lands inventory says we have enough property, we have enough property. And Metro says, well, okay, you got enough property, so we don't have to expand the urban growth boundary. When you don't expand the urban growth boundary, where do? You grow up. You have to increase that density and you grow up. So the city, rather than rezoning a property, like my idea of the 600 feet along Hawthorne, you take that first block and you say, well, let's make that R1. Let's make that R2. Okay, instead of the 2.5 that it is, to allow multifamily properties to be built right along those corridors, right? That would increase density where it should happen, It would also offset financially the people that are now living behind a 4 or 5 story building that get no sun. Now their property is worth more. They could potentially sell that for more money, multifamily could go in there. So we also ran into this thing, you probably heard this term, missing middle, right? Well, this missing middle is what was latched onto by Commissioner Novick, and it suddenly got forced into the comprehensive plan at the last minute. Missing middle is what Portland had and has quite a bit of. When you drive around neighborhoods like Buckman, Sunnyside, Richmond, you know, you see, oh look, that's a fourplex, I can tell, that's a big single family house, but it's actually 4 apartments. Or we got this little cluster apartment building that's kind of tucked in the neighborhood. So those are the missing middle things that this project is supposed to allow to happen. So by infusing duplexes, triplexes into a neighborhood like this, you're providing presumably a lower cost area of housing or lower cost product so that more people can move in here. And that's going to happen, that's what they're hoping for all over. Now, I didn't believe any of this. And so I asked them, I said, well, you've got this overlay, you've got this A overlay, right? You might, I didn't know about it, but this A overlay was established in 1998 to try to offset some of the gentrification that was happening in Albina. So I said, well, how successful was that? You're letting certain areas of Portland get additional density because of this A overlay, right? So I asked them, I said, give me some information on this. So it took about a month to do it. And I finally came back with this fabulous map. There are 44,000 lots in Portland that have this A overlay, have the potential for additional density. Only, I think it's 230 have taken advantage of that. So here's an idea that they tried that isn't working. Why? Because this was it was in Lentz, it was in King, but it was also in Selwood Moreland. But that's where these 44,000 lots were. But at the time they're doing it, the developers didn't want to build there. So this project, the Infill project, is depending on developers bailing us out of this influx of 230,000 people. And we're counting on them to do the right thing, to provide affordable housing for anybody who wants it.
Well, ta-da.
And what are the odds of that?
Well, not.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't happen. So one of the good things that happened out of that December meeting, we're not quite sure how it's going to land, is eliminating this idea of the underlying lot line. And so R5 means R5. So if you've got, who had the 7,500 square foot lot?
I've got
You've got,
8,500.
yeah, you got the 8,000 square foot lot. I'm certain there's an underlying lot line there that under this proposal, you would not be able to activate that underlying lot line. The city, the planning department is pushing back so hard on that. I wouldn't be surprised if that somehow ends up back in the mix. So, it's an amazing thing what history does. Everyone know what that is? You probably all know what that is, right?
What is?
The underlying lot line.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, you've
Historic
seen,
lot lines.
yeah, you've seen enough of it. So, let's talk about density for a minute, okay? Because this was also very interesting to me. How dense, what is the optimum density that we're looking for?
Right.
Well, no one knows, we don't get an answer for that. So, Sunnyside has a density of 19.7 people per acre. We are the 6th densest neighborhood in all of Portland. And you drive through it, you know, where there's a lot of houses for this little area. Eastmoreland has a density of 7.1 people per acre. And you look around, well, that's pretty true. But you are not, you are not the density, the least density in all. I mean, Cully has got a density that's very close to yours. Now, you could say in Cully, well, 1/3 of Cully is industrial. So let's take that out of the mix. Their density kicks up to about 10. You could say, well, take the golf course out of here. We shouldn't really be counting that because, and
I
so
think
you're.
they should build on that.
Yeah, a lot of
Well,
people do.
Yeah, they might. So your density also goes back up to 10. So you are not the least dense, aside from everybody's feeling that, you know, we're in this incredible, luxurious, open feeling. You know, you are not the least dense neighborhood in Portland by far. You fall somewhere in the middle. But if this happens, your density will, the whole idea is to increase density. And that's what they're pushing for.
I've got a question now. If somebody presents a problem to you, in order to resolve the thing, you gotta have an answer. What should, maybe this is the wrong group, what should happen to those additional people coming in? Where can they move? How can we provide housing for those 233,000 people?
Well, number one, we could expand that urban growth boundary that I don't want to happen.
Yeah.
Okay? Not many people do.
Number one.
Okay? Or you take the zoning that's already on the books, like the R1 and the R2, and you put them where it belongs. You change the zoning. You don't cover the entire city with an overlay saying you can do this everywhere. So you take that area along the centers and corridors, along Powell, maybe along Holgate, along Belmont, along Division, and you change the zoning in there so that you can allow this missing middle to happen. You can build these things already with the current zoning, but you can't do it on a 2.5. You know, you gotta change to R2. I suggested that to the planning department. I had whole drawings of, change this in Sunnyside. We want this changed from 2.5 to R2. Not interested. But yet, cover the entire city.
So why do you think they're not interested?
I don't know. I wish I knew, Karen. I wish I knew the answer.
It's supposedly about equity.
About what?
Equity.
Equity.
Oh,
That we're too big for our britches, even though most of the people who lived here worked their lives off to get here.
Right, exactly.
You know, this was an aspirational community.
Right.
You know,
Well, I mean, if you look at all of Portland though, not just the east side, that's, I think,
Well, it's not the West Hills.
Well, but we're talking about all of Portland, yes?
Right, pretty much.
And so where does this elitist stuff come in
Well,
here?
well, let me go back a little bit. What I think part of the issue is, again, relying on developers to bail us out of this, or to do the right thing. Developers only want to build where they can make money.
Yes.
Now, suddenly St. John's has become a pretty popular spot. And I haven't seen a whole lot, but yet they're not developing out in Lents. They're not developing east of 82nd.
Of course.
You know, they want to develop where people want to move, you know, they want to move into Sunnyside, in Buckman, and in Richmond, and that whole area that I'm in. And we see this, and I go, boy, look at all this land, look at all this green land here, this open land, this underutilized resource that we have. So, you're already, I mean, there are a number, I just recently got an ADU map. And there are a number of ADUs that have happened around Eastmoreland. I was kind of surprised.
Yeah.
The ADU thing has happened almost uniformly around Portland. I think there's something like 800 ADUs that have been built in the last few years. And I was trying to figure out, well, who builds ADUs? Is there, economics, this, that, and the other thing. And it's very evenly distributed. I was kind of surprised. So, but yet Commissioner Fish was saying, well, here's a resource. Here again is another one of these incentives that we're giving people. Why hasn't this taken off? You know, why don't we look at what we have on the books already, try to fix that, to fix the A overlay zone, to fix the duplexes on the corner, to fix the idea that within 500 feet of a transit area you can build additional units. Why aren't these things working? Well, their answer was, let's cover the whole city with it. Let the developers build whatever they want anywhere.
It's crazy. I mean, I have kind of the amateur's interest in urban planning, but from everything that I've read, well-planned cities, and Portland talked about this in the past, attempt to increase density in transit corridors. We've got, I find it amazing that a city that prides itself on its excellent public transportation is not taking advantage of that to concentrate the new development where people can access transit. In other words, like within 500 feet or so of Hawthorne, for example. If you just allow a scattering of development over the city, what do? you make the city more auto-oriented than it already is. I mean, most people here are auto-oriented, but it'll get much worse with.
No, Warren, you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct that this is not where it should be done. But because the committee had 10 developers, or however many we had, and housing affordability advocates that were screaming, we need more affordable housing, you know, this is what we ended up with. And the city the planning department, I'm certain, is being pushed from higher up to, you know, to do this thing. I mean, I really don't have any ill feelings about the staff. I think the staff it's like, you know, they're just good soldiers telling them what the commissioners and what their bosses are telling them to do.
Got a question over here.
Yes.
So two quick questions for you. I'm sitting here thinking about the fact, I understand the structure of Metro, Senate Bill 100, the urban growth boundary, and you know what? We can plan and do whatever we want to do, but the growth is going to materialize on its own. It really is. Climate change will drive it, lifestyle refugees will drive it, retirees will drive it, and regardless of what happens with the infill, I got a hunch we probably don't have enough. So you know what? Prices will be beyond the reach of people. There's not a lot of affordable housing here when you look at the local economy. So this is like a self-deceptive policy. You know, someone's living in La La Land and it's spelled PDX. This is my opinion. The question I have beyond the editorial is, we sit south of the Bybee Bridge from McLaughlin down to Milwaukee City Hall is an industrial commercial dead zone, other than OLCC. That's an abandoned Tonkin dealership. There's not much there. It's adjacent to the Orange Line. We have the opportunity to build something really special there that could be high density, multi-income, mixed commercial, residential, and conceivably a car-free zone. Has that ever come up in any of these discussions?
Well, George, we brought that up a lot. In fact, we kept saying, why are we focusing on spreading this density all over the city? Why don't we focus on creating new centers? And if any of you have been out by Gateway,
Yes.
Yes.
where I go for my colonoscopy, and it is one of these residential kind of, I mean, here is the transit, here's what the city invested a lot of money out there. Why hasn't this taken off? You know, what else do we need to do to make Gateway go? Or why can't we increase, like the area around Kenton or King? You know, we see Williams Avenue in Mississippi, that is, you know, that you could, some people, I call it a great restaurant, some people call it a success. The neighborhood calls it a failure because it's gentrified all of King and all, so we keep pushing people out. Well, okay. So, but why don't we create more centers, which is exactly what you're saying. Not interested.
Tom, what?
Well, first, I grew up in Tillamook, so the label of elitist doesn't bother me at all. Secondly, you said earlier that this was a political problem and not a policy problem. What's the political solution?
I believe the political solution will be that they will adopt this and it will not lead to much. Because, and that's why I investigated these other incentives. I sense right now, as we're heading into the next recession, things are slowing down. And so the impact of this residential infill might not be felt for another 8 years when suddenly we are getting triplexes on the corner. But back to what George was talking about, we did our own financial analysis because we didn't believe what the city had put out. And our professor from PSU determined that the infill project will only benefit people who don't need to be benefited. That people that make $70,000 a year plus will be the ones that will be able to afford what this residential infill project will provide.
Yeah.
So people making the $30,000 or $35,000 or $40,000 or the $18, $15 an hour, we all voted for the $258 million affordable housing referendum. Take that money, buy these houses, renovate them, form community land trusts, sell those houses to the people that can afford them, and keep that all owned by the community. So that when they're sold, they get, the people get their profit, but yet the land is still owned by the city for the next affordable housing group that needs to come in. And that hasn't fallen anywhere. Working with Brandon, Spencer Hartle on this, trying to get developers who do these small, these small renovations, the neighborhood guys that you never hear about. We have some in Sunnyside that are not tearing down houses, they're taking a horrible house and they're renovating it and putting their blood, sweat and tears to rent it out. Those are the guys we want, developing these sorts of, it's my idea to develop these sorts of zombie houses. Their problem, let's fix the problem. We have the money for it, why don't we do it? Won't happen. There was no discussion about infrastructure. Do we have sewers in the street to handle all this? Do we have water supply?
sorry,
Do we have anything? Are the streets,
We just had them redone.
yeah, there's been no discussion of that whatsoever. When you take right now today, when you take the idea that every corner can have a duplex, that every house can have an ADU, that within 500 feet of a commercial corridor you can build an additional unit, and you take my A overlay discussion, okay, suddenly you add all those things up regardless of what's on that land now. You add all those things up and voila, you have enough land.
I mean, it's demolition.
But so
That's
there,
right. That's
so there
exactly
isn't
right.
undeveloped land within the urban growth boundary?
I can't answer that. There is. I mean,
Okay.
my house was built on an empty lot that never had a house on it.
But
So
so
it's
why are they
enhancing.
calling it, why do they call it the infill project?
Well, I think
Is
that's
it just based on the ADUs and
No, I
the,
think it's just because, you see a house being torn down and something is going in, and that they call that infill. Here we've been pushing this rock up the hill for 18 months, meeting with commissioners, trying to get there to listen, to reason, and we're getting nowhere. So what's the recourse? The recourse is what you're doing. To say, we're gonna do this ourselves. We have this great neighborhood, we have lots of open land, the houses are all appropriately sized. Imagine if that house next door comes down and you get a duplex with an ADU, behind it. And suddenly from a single family, now you've got 3 families living there. So I think that people understand, when it's sort of like, this is all interesting and blah, blah, blah. It's like, I was telling someone, I said, no one really wakes up until a 5-story building is going up in your backyard. You say, how did this happen? Well, this happened back in 2018 when the residential infill project was approved.